Our next section is Facing the Future, and to kick it off, Dr. David Pizarro asks one of the most important questions facing us in the future. What moral dilemmas might we face in a future when technology and machines go head-to-head with humans? David's talk is titled Facing the Future, Moral Psychology and Technological Resistance. In his talk, he will highlight technological innovations that are driving the development of consumer products and services, such as artificial intelligence, machine learning, algorithmic decision-making. And Dr. Pizarro will show how behavior science can help us understand the human impacts of these technologies. Dave is an associate professor of psychology at Cornell University and a chief science officer at BEworks since 2012. He's been an integral part of establishing the company's experimentation and data standards. In his academic career, he's considered a world-renowned expert on moral judgments and emotions. He studies how emotions like anger and disgust and fear impact how people process information, remember events, and make moral judgments of others. He's also dedicated his career in studying the interaction between people and machines, which is the focus of his keynote talk today. And stay tuned, because after his keynote, I hold a fireside chat with Dr. David Pizarro.
Hello. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. It's my pleasure to talk to you this afternoon. And what I want to talk about is, as the intro said, advances in technology and the barriers that they face. Not technological barriers, but rather psychological barriers. So we're seeing ever increasing gains from technological innovation. Many of these technologies have the potential to bring about great benefit to humankind. But while that innovation sometimes stumbles, again, because of technological barriers, I want to focus on some of the psychological barriers, namely our social and moral intuitions. These are being stretched by new technologies, and they're ill-equipped to handle the changing technological landscape. After all, technology advances at a far more rapid pace than we can adapt to. So, our psychology, our decision-making, our judgment, our intuitions, our emotions, is the product of a brain that evolved thousands of years ago under very different conditions, physical and social conditions. Our social and moral intuitions became fine-tuned to a social environment that was really different. We were in small-scale societies, maybe 100, 150 people. We were hunter-gatherers. But we're trying to use that brain to make decisions and judgments about things that we face today that never would have been faced by our ancestors. So in other words, we're using old technology to make new decisions. And to put it simply, we can't update the firmware on our brains. We're sort of stuck with the psychology that we have. And these very old intuitions can easily lead to a lack of adoption of beneficial new technologies and even to a stifling of innovation. At least that's what I want to argue. Now, I think beneficial technologies will always find a way to insert themselves into our society. But what I really want to talk about is the pace of innovation and how that might be improved if we take into account the human psychology that might be a barrier towards it. Before I get to some more serious examples, let me give you two examples of technological resistance that sort of led me down the path of being interested in this technological innovation and our psychology. The first comes from car manufacturers. So at some point, engineers at BMW became so good at what they did that their cockpit was entirely silent. That is, you would get into the car, start your engine, be going down the freeway, and you would hear nothing from your engine. Well, it turns out people didn't like this. They bought a BMW for a reason. One of those reasons might be to hear the engine. Moreover, they were used to knowing that the engine was working and how it was working by listening to the sounds. They were getting feedback from the engine. So rather than make the cockpit less sealed, BMW engineers developed an algorithm to pump fake engine noise into the cockpit. Now, that fake engine noise was very responsive to the conditions which the driver was driving under. So if the driver accelerated, the fake engine noise rumbled through the speakers of the car. So thousands, if not millions of dollars was put into this technology merely because the drivers were used to hearing engine noise. They did not want to adapt to this new technology. Okay, let me give you another example. This example comes from a conversation I had with the behavioral economist Sendil Mullainathan. And when I was talking to him, he gave me this anecdote about Indian farmers. And when they were first introduced to tractors, up until then, they had been using oxen as beasts of burden to do their farming. Basically, they were their living tractors. Well, what the field researchers noted was that, even after a reluctant adoption of the tractors, the farmers would go every night out into the fields where the tractors were, and they would put a blanket over the tractor. So even when they were adopting a novel technology, they were doing something that might be a great thing for the oxen, but obviously had no beneficial impact for the tractor. Again, an example that people can fail to adopt innovative technology, or sometimes they can adopt it but use it in a way that's more congruent with the intuitions that they've already developed, maybe what they're used to from prior technologies. So these examples that I just gave you are examples of technological adoption troubles, barriers to technological adoption based on previous experience. So the experience of driving a car, the experience of using oxen for farming. But I want to talk about some of the deeper intuitions and how they might be affecting our judgment and our adoption of technology. So many psychologists believe that some of these social and moral intuitions are among the deepest that we have. They're part of the evolved human mind. These are intuitions about other agents, whether they're good or bad, intuitions about how decisions ought to be made, about who to blame and who deserves blame, even basic intuitions about whether or not people did something on purpose, intentionality, and whether or not they had control over it, agentic intuitions, and even intuitions about privacy, right, and what it means to be able to have privacy in a social setting. These intuitions, which I'll get to, are stubborn, right? And they can often lead us astray in funny and interesting ways. So let's focus for a second on privacy and intuitions about privacy. These are interesting because they point to a certain kind of failure that we have. For instance, we voluntarily post a ton of information on social media. We carry tracking devices with us at all times in the form of a phone. We are comfortable that in many cities, in some countries, there are cameras that are constantly on and recording our actions. And these cameras are visible and they're surveilling us. So if privacy was really something that we cared about on at a principled level, all of this might bother us. We would not carry the phones that we carry. We wouldn't have devices like Alexa or Siri activated. But those forms of observation, like this surveillance camera here, don't trigger our sense that our privacy is being violated, at least not anywhere near as strongly as some other cues. So what does? The same things that would have triggered that you might be having a violation of privacy 1,000 years ago. If someone stands close to you when you're speaking to a friend, we lower our voice. If someone is staring at us from across the room and you can feel their gaze, that's creepy. We don't like it. We're very sensitive to the presence of others, and we're extremely attuned. There's a lot of good psychological work on this. We're extremely attuned to the eye gaze of others. And so this is why security cameras aren't designed like this, right? If they were, we would immediately have our intuitions sort of spike and give us a warning sign that somebody is looking at us. So you can imagine a city of CCTV cameras, all with these anthropomorphic masks on top of them. People might actually start to feel very differently about being surveilled. Matter of fact, let's look at the example of Google Glass. This was a product released a few years ago, in development for many years at Google. They provided their wearers with heads-up displays of information. Many of you are probably familiar with this. But in many places, these glasses were banned entirely. People felt very uncomfortable with them. And in fact, this is probably a big reason that Google stopped development on these. People had some resistance toward others wearing these glasses. Now, it can't be a coincidence that the cameras were placed so close to the eyes of other individuals. Because after all, we carry cameras around with us at all times, right? We have cameras on our phones. We could have a GoPro around our neck and we could be recording everybody. Chances are it wouldn't raise the same alarms as seeing somebody's eyes with a recording device. Because again, we're attuned psychologically to faces, to eyes, to eye gaze. So, intuitions about privacy don't really track privacy well because our intuitions haven't evolved in the situations that we find ourselves in now. There were no cameras, there was no mass surveillance, there weren't recording devices in our pockets and in our living rooms. And because of that, we're fairly inconsistent with our emotional responses to our privacy being violated. Okay, let's turn to what I am really interested in, which is algorithmic decision-making. So algorithmic decision-making is the use of machines to aid in human decisions. Machines can, in a wide variety of cases, make much better decisions than humans. They can work harder, they can work faster, they can work longer than human brains. They can process a lot more information. They're not limited by fatigue. They are not biased as long as they're programmed right. And in fact, a lot of algorithms are making decisions for us every day, at all times, and we have no idea. But they're there making decisions about supply chain distribution, about risk management, about medical diagnoses. Algorithms fly and land thousands of planes every day. Chances are, if you've been on a plane recently, it was landed solely by a computer. And we're content to get directed by algorithms in many aspects of our life, even if we do know that those algorithms are behind the decisions that are being made. So Spotify will suggest songs. Algorithms decide what news items we see on Facebook, what products we see on Amazon or Instagram, and even what route we take to work. Now, obviously, some of these algorithms make mistakes. Amazon suggestions for what I should buy next are often laughable. They tell me to buy the thing that I just bought, and they can make much worse mistakes. But what I want to focus on is the difficulty we have accepting the decision-making of machines, even when we know that those decisions are benefiting us. My worry is that we're foregoing the very real benefits of using these algorithms to optimize decisions across many domains in which a great deal of good can come from turning things over to computers. So, just like intuitions about privacy, we might have certain intuitions about privacy, we also have certain intuitions about computers making decisions for us. And in fact, this is Deep Blue. Just to illustrate, this is the computer that beat Garry Kasparov at chess. Computer much smaller nowadays can do the same thing. There's no shot that a computer won't beat most chess players in the world. But there is something about these algorithms in some cases that really bothers us. And researchers have coined this algorithm aversion or algorithmic aversion. especially we are bothered by algorithms that are making decisions that we view as moral in some way or another. We are especially averse to having machines make ethical decisions, even when those decisions can lead to a more positive outcome than any humans making those decisions. For instance, in a recent paper by the psychologist Kurt Gray, he showed that people dislike decisions made autonomously by a computer, not only when they make errors, but even when they lead to a successful medical outcome, or the decisions of a computer, an autonomous computer, when they lead to a successful missile strike, not just when they mess up. When compared to the same decision made by a human, people prefer human decision making. Even when decisions like parole violations are made by a computer, we have deep suspicions of it. Journalists and consumers point to the amount of bias in algorithms, but rarely do they compare it to the amount of bias in human decision making, right? So this is in the Gray paper, for instance, they had the computer making specific judgments about investment in more moral companies. So even when a computer was allowed to decide to avoid certain kinds of products because they were morally tainted, people just weren't happy with it. They preferred the decision to be made by a human. Again, even if it was the same decision. Same with medical decision making. When it comes to moral medical decision making, when ethics are involved, we're just uncomfortable. Autonomous vehicles, this plays out a lot. There's now a vast literature on autonomous vehicles and ethical decision making. And it just turns out that we're very uncomfortable with our cars having to make judgments about life or death. So just think of, for instance, the amount of media attention that's gained when an autonomous vehicle crashes compared to the amount of media attention that the thousands and thousands of crashes from human drivers gets every day. There is something about turning the control over these decisions to computers that actually makes us uncomfortable. So by now there have been a number of demonstrations that we don't like it if the computer in our car has to decide between, for instance, saving one life and hitting another, if it has to swerve to avoid one person but will inevitably hit another person. For some reason, people prefer that they're the ones making those decisions and reject the computer's decisions. Let me give you another example, one that is actually sort of dear to my heart because of my involvement in some of these institutions that are trying to improve the amount of good done by charitable donations. Effective altruism, as a movement, just describes a group of people who are looking to maximize the amount of good that they can make with their dollar, with any given dollar. So what they do is they pour through the data across all charities. They have spreadsheets, algorithms that determine what the best use of a dollar is to optimize the amount of good in the world. They're driven by a sort of utilitarian ethic. Let's maximize. Why give your dollar to something that will only help somebody a little bit when you can give a dollar to a charity that will save a life? A lot of people are uncomfortable with this as well. They don't think that these kinds of decisions should be made by a cold and calculating computer. They think that in the domain of charity, you ought to be motivated by compassion and by empathy. In fact, in some studies coming out of our lab, we even show that if a person makes the judgment, much like a computer might, in a very rational, deliberate way, poring over the data, makes a decision to make a charitable donation, people view that as less moral than if people make a decision based on empathy or in compassion. People have a real sense, not just of what decision is right, but of how decisions ought to be made. And computers seem to lack the features of decision-making that we value in humans, those warmer, tender emotions that we care about, loyalty, empathy, compassion. As of now, computers can't have that. So people have a distrust of computers in the moral and ethical domain. So what do we do? What is the solution? Well, if you accept what I'm saying, that there are many ways in which we can optimize and benefit the world through innovative technologies, whether they be in the financial realm, decision-making tools in the financial realm, or in the healthcare realm, or in charitable contributions. If you accept that computers might actually be able to yield better, to come up with better decisions, what can we do to make this easier on our intuitions? What can we do to increase the pace of adoption of these technologies? Well, there are a few things that have been shown, demonstrated by researchers. The biggest one is what we might call a human in the loop. Oh, sorry, this is an example of ethically autonomous robots used in war. People have gotten very, very upset that you might have a robot placed in the middle of a war situation making decisions about right and wrong, somehow missing that humans under those conditions also make very, very bad decisions. Okay, so solutions. The biggest solution, according to the research, is what we might call human in the loop. This is simply inserting a human into the decision-making process at some point. So people are much more comfortable with computers making these decisions if they know that a human being has seen the decision. So inserting them at some point, whether it be supervisory or whether it be just to check the answers. Sorry, my headphones got unplugged, so I'm plugging them back in. That seems to be one solution, right? That's sort of just going back to taking a step back again to embrace our intuitions, inserting somebody there. And this makes sense because one of the features of computer decision-making that bothers individuals is that there is no agent that can be blamed when things go wrong. So if a computer messes up, if your autonomous vehicle gets a blue screen of death and you get in a car accident, you can't shake your fist at the blue screen of death. Who do you blame? Do you blame Elon Musk? Do you blame the programmer? Do you blame that particular version of software that was being used? If you put an agent in the loop, then it gives people somebody to hold accountable. I think more importantly, we should use better design. So a lot of what we seem to be averse when it comes to computer decision-making is that we don't have control over the decisions. Like human beings don't have control. Now, again, this is sort of just accepting the inevitable that humans want some control over it. They don't want to turn over decision-making to computers. But what can be done, and what some researchers have shown, is that in the design process of a technology, if you include some bits where the user feels like they have control over the decisions being made, it actually doesn't even have to be real control. It can be just the illusion of control. People are much more likely to adopt those technologies. Design for transparency. One of the issues that we have with algorithmic decision-making is that we often don't know how the decision is being made. This is especially true for machine learning algorithms that essentially are a black box. We don't exactly know how they made the decision, but not all algorithms are like that. And in cases in which there is the ability to describe how the decision is being made, how the algorithm was constructed, people become much more comfortable with adopting the algorithm, and they become much happier with the outcome of optimizing their decision making. Finally, there is something in line with the transparency that is often not communicated, and that is, what are the standards being used to determine that a decision is good, that it's optimal, that it's rational? It's often unclear to people whether there is agreement between them and the decision that the computer is making. So for instance, if you ask an average driver what the right decision for an autonomous vehicle to do is when, say, the car is out of control and about to hit 3 pedestrians, or it can drive off of the bridge and only kill the one driver. In the abstract, people say, yeah, the algorithm should do the greatest good for the greatest number of people and save the 3. But when told that it's their car and they're the driver, they firmly say, no, the right answer is to protect me. It's my car after all. So making clear what the rational standards are and seeing how congruent or incongruent they are with what the human being thinks the correct answer ought to be is a step that we can take in order to make some of these decisions go more smoothly. Okay, I'll end there just with simply saying we could just turn over a ton of our decisions to algorithms, and I think we would probably have a net benefit. But that's not going to happen anytime soon. So in the meantime, what we have to do is find ways to create congruence between these old intuitions that we have about what's right and wrong, what's good and bad, about other agents, and find ways to make us more comfortable with the way the computers are making decisions and make those computers adapt a little bit to our intuitions for now. I'll end there. Thank you very much for your time.
Moving to the open mic session. What a 4-hour, I'm exhausted. I don't know how you're feeling, but there's just so many territories that we covered today, and they weren't, as I promised, skips in the park. These were some tough ground to travel. And when you think of what we've covered over the last 4 hours, and from Kelly's opening remarks, where she really set the stage in terms of launching a movement, scientific process, behavioral economics, not just tackling little things like, can I grow my market share, but really important things like stakeholder capitalism and the climate crisis and this sense of food waste, why people are going hungry. And so what we want to do now is just really bring back 4 of this brain trust together. Kelly's going to join us, Michael, David's, and of course, Nathaniel or Nate. And we're going to just have an open conversation about what's next. And I think we're going to get the 2 of them on the screen. And so, great. David, can you hear me all right? I think he's just coming on.
Yes, I can.
Perfect. Good. Listen, fantastic conversation. If I can, I want to tell you a story and have you just sort of comment on it. I was hosting a global payment conference, and this guy was talking about going back home to his he happened to be doing a thing in Shanghai. He went to visit his parents who lived in a little village in China. As he's walking into their house, he noticed a camera right over their front door. And he just couldn't understand why his parents, who were very simple people, would have this security camera. And he walked in and they explained, well, no, the Chinese government has installed these cameras everywhere. And he said, the look on my face, it just, I drained. I couldn't believe that you were under such a privacy attack. And they said, what'd you think about it? And they said, well, actually, we're really happy because there's no longer any crime. So I'm curious from your point of view, as you start thinking about intuition and adopting technology and marching in step with it, is it really going to be due to personalizing the benefits to the individual? And if so, what role can behavioral economics play in moving things forward so that we view those machines and artificial intelligence as an opportunity, as something that can enlighten society versus thrust humans in the dark ages?
Right. I love your example. Oh, my headphones got disconnected again. I love your example because it highlights something that I was trying to say about the driverless car, the deeply different intuitions when the benefit is clearly to me and maybe not to society. So maybe that is one route to have people adopt some of these technologies, to highlight in a selfish way the benefits to them. And I think actually that's how most of these things are marketed. So we have Ring doorbells that we install. I have a Ring doorbell right in my house. I love it because I get to see everything that's going on in my house. I don't like it so much that everybody else has one and that there are probably video records of me walking my dog every single day. That sort of bothers me. So there has to be the right balance, I think, between emphasizing the societal benefit and perhaps emphasizing the selfish benefit, because when sometimes they clash and people are more than willing to actually abandon their personal benefit because they think that it might actually come with some harm. Like I may just not like that there are video records of me walking all through my neighborhood from my neighbors.
Is there an arc, or is there a storyline where people can erase the intuitions of the past and be much more open-minded to the fact that, again, they're not, these machines and artificial intelligence and network of learning aren't necessarily foes, but they can be friends? Is there a way that you approach it from a scientific way, that in a staged approach, or is it all or nothing?
Well, they're hard intuitions to shake, but I do think that one of the best ways to do this is to make these algorithms hidden. I mean, so in some sense, like I was mentioning, there are a ton of ways that algorithms are aiding in our the decisions made by the powers that be all around us. It's really when they become salient to us that we start having a problem. So making them sort of invisible, or making them so innocuous and with such a clear advantage, like Spotify suggesting new playlists for me. The problem is, if we find out that Spotify is selling our data, then those intuitions can kick in, and sure, they can be overridden by just pure reason, but we have a whole body of research in behavioral economics and psychology showing that overriding some of these intuitions with reason is very difficult. And there are individual differences. Some people do it better than others, but it is an uphill battle.